Well, then this morning we're looking at South Africa's position as the current president of the United Nations Security Council. It's a rotating presidency, and so far people have been saying it's quite an important position. Let me welcome here on the program then to make sense of the importance of this position and how South Africa can make it count my two very esteemed guests. I'm starting here with Khuseni Dlamini. He is a member of the National Council of the South African Institute of International Affairs at Wits University. Mr. Dlamini, good morning. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Xolani, and good morning to the listeners. Thank you for having me.
Thanks indeed. On the line, I'm joined by Dr. Siphamandla Zondi. He's Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Dr. Zondi, good to have you on the show.
Good morning, Xolani, and how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you.
Good time.
Thank you very much.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too, Mr. Dlamini.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, let me start with you, Mr. Dlamini. Firstly, just let's look at the role of the presidency of the Security Council of the United Nations. Is it an important position? If so, how and why?
It is a very important position, Xolani, in the sense that it is really at the heart of coordinating and planning and organizing the UN's agenda. Although it's just for a month, some may argue it's symbolic, but for South Africa, taking the position as we do at the beginning of the year, it allows us an opportunity to set the tone in global affairs by not just organizing and planning and coordinating the affairs of the UN, but by also selecting certain themes that we see as crucial from a South African foreign policy point of view to start with, but most importantly, from an African regional or continental point of view, which is why I believe that the decision by Pretoria to select the issue of the relationship between the AU and the UN as a centerpiece of South Africa's presidency is a very sound and very prudent one.
Okay, we'll look in detail at that decision then by Pretoria to deal with matters of relations. But we've been here before. We've presided over the UN Security Council in the past when we had the other stint within the United Nations Security Council. How did we fare?
The first stint we had was in March 2007,
and
that was followed by April 2008. What is interesting to note, Xolani, is that there is continuity in terms of the themes that Pretoria has identified. And this was the theme that during the era of former Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Dlamini Zuma, and under the presidency of President Thabo Mbeki, this was the theme that was chosen. And it's interesting, again, to see that we are continuing with this theme. There have been a number of questions and mixed interpretations of how we've fared previously. There have been questions around how we handled issues such as the issue of Myanmar, for example, the issues around Zimbabwe in the UN Security Council, and most recently there have been debates around Resolution 1973, which was ostensibly a resolution to enforce a free zone in Libya. But it was used ultimately to execute what some have seen as regime change in that country.
Just talking about that, then Baso Sango just a couple of days ago already called for an investigation into human rights abuses committed during NATO's bombing campaign to oust Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. In your mind, is that in line with Pretoria's aim of creating that relationship between the AU and the UN?
I think the key thing is to look at how do we move forward and how do we learn from the past and how do we use the present to build a very sound future that will allow Africa to have an equitable and respected voice at the United Nations. To the extent that we want to know the facts about what went wrong around NATO's interpretation or manipulation of Resolution 1973, maybe Baso is absolutely right that we need to understand the past in order to move forward. But I'll argue strongly, Xolani, that one of the key things is really to look at how do we put in place concrete mechanisms that will effectively ensure that we do not have a repeat of the same situation.
Because some analysts are saying that harping on about what happened in Libya may very well alienate some of our important partners, if you will, at the United Nations level, partners that can assist us in creating that relationship between the AU and the UN, but also partners that will assist us as we seek a permanent position within the United Nations Security Council.
I think what we need now is to build a global consensus around our agenda in the United Nations Security Council. We also need to build global consensus around our bid to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council with veto power. So we need to strategically look at building a coalition of the willing, rallying all the support that we can get from different role players in the United Nations and in the rest of the international community.
But the problem with the Libyan issue is that, one, it casts countries such as the United Kingdom as imperialists who were looking for oil in Libya, actually as the bad guys. Now, as we continue, of course, looking at and investigating those issues, it continues to cast them in that light. And to what extent then are we alienating them in our quest to become permanent members?
The manipulation of UN resolutions and indeed the manipulation of the UN system itself is hardly a new phenomenon. But the key thing is to stop it. And maybe by saying, let's understand what went wrong and why did things happen the way they did, and how can we make sure that we stop the repeat of the same kind of situation. And maybe that's the way to go. But your point around being careful not to alienate other key role players is a well-made point, and that's a point that needs to be managed very carefully.
And Dr. Zondi, let me bring you in then in this one, because again there are those issues. Clearly, you've got to be very diplomatic about how you handle this and how you make it count. How would you suggest South Africa makes its presidency count?
I think it is to focus on its long-term agenda, which is really to make the UN Security Council a much more transparent organization, much more democratic organization, and enhance its credibility by ensuring that it does well in a number of principal areas. One of those is this idea of coordination between the UN Security Council and the African Union, because I tell you, that question is very fundamental, because even the issues that have arisen over Cote d'Ivoire, over Libya, over Zimbabwe and other issues speak to questions around how the UN Security Council exercises its power to resolve many of the African problems without alienating Africa itself. So the long-term solution to all these challenges, including what happened in Libya, is to get the UN Security Council to establish concrete measures, concrete procedures, and concrete principles with regards to how you coordinate and align the work of the African Union organization as a regional organization responsible for African security, governance and development, and the UN, which is responsible overall for global security and development. And I think if you get that right, if we continue where we ended in 2007, 2008, after the Prodi report, which established actually a basis for consensus globally about how you coordinate the regional organizations, UN work, we would go a long way to preventing what happened in Libya, unfortunately.
Because again, some analysts see this as an opportunity for South Africa to elevate the African agenda, as you point out. But the issue is, first, we need to understand the state of the relationship between the AU and the UN. How would you characterize it?
It is a relationship that has evolved over a period of time. I would say that after 2007, it has improved quite remarkably. You remember that the Romano Prodi report, which looked into the relationship between the UN and the regional organizations, was actually an agenda of the African Union and the African group within the UN Security Council, and they were successful in getting that report to be accepted in the UN Security Council, and that set off a number of processes that is leading towards what we are now sitting on, which is looking at the concrete measures that would intensify, solidify, strengthen the relationship between regional organization and the UN, and in particular the AU. You would remember that on that basis then we have a number of hybrid missions, peacekeeping missions between the UN and the AU, principally the one in Darfur. And that was an important test case and an important pilot study in how you could actually concretize this relationship. And it is good that the UN Security Council has decided to extend the mandate of this UN AU hybrid mission in Darfur last year, because it builds a case evermore for a concretized coordination between the AU and the UN, so that there should never be a gulf built between them by the actions of major countries that may have their own self-interests.
All right. What I'll do also is open the lines here on 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. Send us an SMS as well. What are your observations? What can South Africa do in order to make sure that the African agenda, I guess, is enhanced, that the African agenda is elevated at the United Nations level? Give us a call as well on 0891 104 208. Send us an SMS at 34701, 34701. Practically, though, if I may come back again to you, Mr. Dlamini, what would you suggest be done from South Africa's point of view in order to advance what Pretoria has already said, that we would like to see a much improved relations between AU and the UN?
I think it's really to focus on the decision-making processes at the UN and make sure that Africa's voice is respected, and also make sure that Pretoria's role is also acknowledged where it is being projected. But more importantly as well, what is crucial is really to deal with some of the long-term challenges facing the UN. It cannot continue to be a representative of the general will of the people of the world so long as it is structured in the way that it is. So in concrete terms, it's really to advance the discussions that Pretoria has already started around reform and democratization of the United Nations, firstly. Secondly, I think in terms of the African agenda, which Siphamandla has spoken about, what is required is really an unpacking of that agenda. What are the top 5 priorities that are key to Africa asserting itself at the UN level? Because it's easier to talk about an African agenda in very broad and generic terms, but we really need to have a clear understanding of the strategic priorities that Africa and South Africa have at the UN and how those priorities are going to be advanced.
I was quite interested in your article a couple of days ago. I think it was just towards the end, where you were calling on the business formations, calling on civil society, academia as well, to rally behind South Africa's efforts to raise the agenda. But is there space for civil society to do that?
I think it's such an important agenda that it can't be left to government alone. And I think the different role players in society have a lot to benefit from South Africa being a powerful force in global affairs. I think from a business point of view, there is so much to be said. If you look at the countries that have got their governments having a permanent membership status and veto power, they are able to leverage that for commercial benefits. So I think to the extent that we as a nation are aspiring to grow and develop and deal with the domestic challenges of poverty and unemployment, we need to be able to link our role in global affairs with the imperative to address some of the domestic socio-economic challenges that we face.